So thanks everybody for joining us this morning. This is another innovation panel where we sort of look ahead at where things are going, and I want to introduce the illustrious VCs that we have on stage with us here. This is probably the only panel that I've ever been on that has two Arifs on the same panel. So first, Arif Hilaly works, he's a partner with Sequoia Capital. He works with enterprise, internet, mobile companies. Prior to joining Sequoia, he was the CEO of ClearWell, a leading provider of analytics software for electronic discovery. He grew ClearWell from a handful of engineers into a profitable company with an annual revenue run rate of more than 100 million, leading to its acquisition in 2011. And prior to that, Arif was the founder and CEO of Centerrun. In the middle, we have Arif Janmohamed. He's a partner with Lightspeed Venture Partners. Joined Lightspeed in 2008, focuses primarily on investments in cloud data center, as well as enterprise mobile and SaaS solutions. He's currently working with the teams at Avi Networks, Memoir Systems, Netscope, Nutanix, Pertino Networks, Kubol, Zova Labs, and Virtual Instruments. And he's also involved in several investments that had successful exits, including EdgeSpring, IO Turbine, Rapsphere, and StreamOnce. Alex Rosen is Managing Director at IDG Ventures. He combines 18 years of venture capital experience with a deep understanding of tech products, making him a valuable advisor to new media and information technology companies. And he currently serves as board director or observer at Expect Labs, Crux Digital, Minted, and SmartLink, and he led IDG Ventures investment in Living Social and WatchGuard Technologies. So I want to talk a little bit, start off by asking your opinions of some of the types of companies that we're starting to see in the enterprise space, specifically with consumerization and focus more on end users, those kinds of systems of engagement, if you want to call them that. One area I've heard a lot about, and I was on stage yesterday with Brett Taylor from Quip, and there are a lot of companies in this kind of social collaboration space. What are you seeing in that space? What's interesting there? What's going on there? And most importantly, what are kind of the challenges and things that need to be overcome before that those types of companies can disrupt the big incumbents? If you could start. Alex.
Sure, I'll start. And I think social collaboration is an interesting area because at some level, every application has some level of collaboration in it. I mean, when I think of social collaboration, I think of companies that come from two different directions. One of them from the document management side, so it's anything from Dropbox and Box and all the collaboration features in it, and then the other side is the messaging side. So it's more sort of communication that has information attached to it. So I think there is a lot of innovation. It's probably an area that's sort of the poster child for the consumerization of IT because so many of the consumer apps are driving what people are doing in the enterprise. So I think there are a lot of new and emerging companies there, and some of them already emerged. Personally, I'm still waiting for somebody to completely change email. And I think that's, maybe it's my just own personal problem with my inbox, but I'm guessing it's the case for everybody else in the audience, that it's both a document management system, it's a note-taking system, it's a to-do box, it's a communication platform. So I think that's an area where I would love to see some more change.
Yeah, I think that the first generation of social collaboration companies we know well, like Yammer, for example, that had a large exit to Microsoft, those were great in terms of, one, bringing people together and trying to solve some of the fundamental many-to-one communication problems. What I would argue now in terms of Gen 2 social collaboration companies is social collaboration actually becomes a fabric inside an application. It's not necessarily a standalone category, but it is actually, call it infrastructure that gets embedded within a mobile application, for example. So we used to see push to call within applications. Well, now it should be push to call, push to message, push to IM, push to conference. Whatever that is, that should be a feature of a next generation consumer-based enterprise type application.
Do you believe in the possibility of a social layer that can be used to tie different applications together? I mean, that was sort of the first generation vision. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, and again, I would argue that that should be infrastructure, core infrastructure. There might be a standalone company that emerges that essentially manages to connect the various applications where the user interface or the system of engagement is what people work with, but on the back end, there could be, call it a next generation type TIBCO or MuleSoft that it emerges just for contextual messaging between applications.
Arif, what do you think is going on in that space, or what have you seen? What have you seen?
I think we're in the very early days of figuring this out, and the window is open because the existing incumbents, people today are still using a traditional workflow of using a Microsoft Office type application to create something and then emailing it around. And I think as that shifts to more of the web-based architecture with the data in the cloud and using a web-based interface, there's scope to create an entirely new class of products centered around design, one that bridges the desktop and mobile. And there are some very smart people like Brett working on that. But no one has yet cracked it. So it's something that we're actively looking for and looking at. We see a lot of bright people working on it, and I think it's something to keep our eyes open for as things bubble up.
And then what about enterprise mobile messaging? That's been a big area lately. They're kind of related. I mean, I sort of feel like a bunch of different companies are attacking the email problem, or the email, if you don't want to call it a problem, how to sort of make email less central. It's a problem. From a different angle. What do you think about those? So that's sort of like taking, some of this first social was taking Facebook and bringing it to the enterprise. This would be saying, taking SMS and bringing it to the enterprise. Seeing any interesting stuff going on there?
I think mobile is probably the biggest wave that has yet to fully hit the enterprise. If you look at the numbers, there'll be about 900 million new devices coming into the workplace over the next 3 years, according to IDC. Today, people are still using it mainly for email and calendar, and that is, we're on the cusp of that changing. As that happens, I think there are going to be a host of new, interesting, enterprise-oriented mobile apps, mobile-first apps, that are going to come from new providers because the form factor is so different, the context in which you use it is different, the session time is shorter. These will be design-driven companies. And I think messaging is one area, but I think there'll be a host of different applications that arise over the next years.
And to talk specifically about messaging, when you open up your phone, you still really need to think about, okay, I want to communicate with someone. What is the priority of the message that I need to send? And what is the medium of the person, what is the preferred medium of the person that I want to communicate with? So you're still forced to think, okay, it's my wife, well, email is probably not appropriate, but she responds to SMS, versus it's my boss, this is an asynchronous communication, maybe I'll send a more formal email. I think over time, we should see convergence of communication mechanisms with just a priority filter, where either, depending on what you want to communicate, you shouldn't have to think about, do I send an email, do I send an SMS, do I call, do I do a conference call? It should essentially just be one app, with security, with compliance, with auditability within the enterprise.
Why is that not so hard to crack? I mean, companies have been talking about unified communication, which is kind of a spin on the same problem for 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before Lightspeed, I was at Cisco Systems, and I was in the mergers and acquisitions group, where one of the companies that I helped acquire was called WebEx. And what we wanted to do with WebEx was essentially build this unified communications layer with conferencing. We bought a company called Postpath for email, Java for IM. The idea being that you should be able to package this up for the enterprise, and again, the user should have to think about what medium they use. But the problem is, people are still used to using email. Right? It's just habit. It's 15, 20 years of habit around email, in my opinion, and it's very difficult to break. Now, I'll use a funny term, millennials, but the millennials are not necessarily used to having to think about what's the subject line of what I want to come up with to message someone. They're using SMS, they're using things like WhatsApp to communicate. So I think they will actually help change the culture within the enterprise.
I'm going to push on that a little bit. I think I have a different view in that I think they're going to continue to be a series of different apps. And Mark Zuckerberg was speaking to the New York Times last week about unbundling the big blue app of Facebook. And that's the direction they're, because the most successful apps create a bookmark in the brain of a person to do that certain thing. And people communicate differently over WhatsApp than they would do over text message than they would do over email. And that's why I feel that all unified messaging attempts have failed in general and will continue to do so. And I see the enterprise mirroring the consumer world where you have different apps, people using them in different ways.
So I'll agree with the second, Arif, that the way that we as human beings communicate differs by channel. If you look back sort of hundreds of years, the way that you would have a in-person communication was different than the way you would write a long-form letter. And then when telegraph came, that was a different means of communication. When telephone came, that was yet another way of communicating. So I do think that we have, I've not thought sort of a bookmark in the brain, but that's a very powerful analogy, that there is a bookmark in the brain for how you communicate with a different person in a different medium. So I do think there'll be a variety of different communication platforms going forward.
Before we move on to a different subject, can each of you name one company who you think is doing a good job at this, and ideally not one of your own portfolio companies? Of doing this new form of communication, replacing email, group collaboration, something like that. Somebody you've been impressed with lately, or?
I'd have to say WhatsApp just because. I'd have to say WhatsApp. It's hard for me to say anything else. Because even though it's not really widely used in the US, if you go anywhere outside the US, it's the #1 app people use, and it's really changed how people communicate. And so that's it.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's necessarily cracked it. There's a bunch of startups that are trying, but this gets back to the problem of priority and the bookmarking rate, which I think is a great analogy. So there's some companies like Slack and GoTap, which are younger companies, which are attempting to do this inside the enterprise.
So I guess I have 19 billion reasons why I would second the WhatsApp.
Another area that we hear a lot about lately is sort of big data analytics. So it seems like the back end, big data technology has been built, and Hadoop is known, and NoSQL is known, and everything. Now we're starting to see a lot of young companies position themselves as, well, here's how you get this information intelligently and display it in the field on mobile devices so it can be used to make real business decisions. How real and big do you think that trend is? And again, what do you think the challenges are that need to be overcome there?
I think every company becomes an analytics company over time, because there is just more and more data being generated, whether it's through sensors in the field, that can, through Beacon that can feed into retailers, or point of sale data, or whatever it is. There's just tons and tons of data, and to be effective in the modern world, you have to be able to mine that and analyze that, or your competition will, and you'll get killed. And so then the choice is really just, well, okay, since analytics is our core competency, what do we do ourselves versus what do we leverage from other people? At the infrastructure level, you can certainly recruit a team and kind of spin up a Hadoop cluster and try and manage that over time. It's incredibly difficult to recruit those people. And I think for most companies, it makes sense to take the quicker option of looking for an outside service provider. And there are a number of people offering Hadoop as a service. We're involved with Virtual Cloud, which is one, and there are many others. There are other well-known companies like Hilaly and so forth. On the display, on the kind of front end, again, there are a bunch of things there are a bunch of great products that can be used there. I think it's just a question of understanding your needs and picking one that fits and then stitching them together. But I think every company has to do it.
Yeah, I would